Shadows of the night, the midnight horror. It was a cold autumn night, just after midnight. The wind outside was gentle, rustling the leaves against the peaceful windowpanes. Joseph lay quietly in his bed, the soft glow of the moon faintly illuminating the room. His eyelids fluttered closed, and he drifted into a calm sleep, his breathing steady. Suddenly he awoke, not with a start, but with a slight, inexplicable feeling, like a whisper of movement nearby. He blinked, looking around, and for a moment thought he saw a faint shadow flicker at the edge of the room near the doorway. But when he focused, the shadow was gone. Probably just a trick of the light, or his mind playing games in the quiet darkness. He hesitated, listening. The house was silent, except for the occasional creak of the old floorboards settling. Joseph dismissed the feeling with a soft chuckle. Probably just the wind, he whispered, convincing himself. He pulled the blanket up, trying to settle back down, telling himself there was nothing to worry about. As he closed his eyes again, he noticed the faintest sensation, a cool breeze brushing gently across his arm, despite the windows being shut. He looked over and saw that the curtains had shifted slightly, as if a breeze had moved them. Yet he knew he'd closed the windows tightly before bed. It was probably a draft from somewhere else, he reasoned, or just his imagination. He smiled softly at himself, feeling reassured. After all, he didn't believe in ghosts or anything supernatural, just the house settling and a tired mind playing tricks. With that thought, he finally drifted back into sleep. The next day was bright and clear, and Joseph went about his routine, dismissing the previous night's little incident as nothing more than a trick of the mind. But as the clock struck midnight again, a strange feeling crept in. This time, it wasn't just a shadow or a breeze. Suddenly, he heard a soft sound, like a faint tapping, almost like a finger lightly brushing against the wall or a door frame. It was so gentle, he almost wondered if he'd imagined it. He sat up in bed and listened. The tapping persisted, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere just outside his room. He hesitated, then quietly got out of bed to check. Peering into the hallway, he saw nothing. The house was silent once more. Maybe it was just the house settling again, or perhaps a loose piece of furniture rubbing against something. He shook his head and returned to bed, trying to dismiss it. Yet, as he lay back down, the feeling of being watched lingered. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to keep him awake for a while longer. The night stretched on, filled with quiet, unexplainable moments, faint movements, distant sounds, shadows that seemed to flicker just beyond his vision. By dawn, Joseph convinced himself it was all just his imagination, nothing more. But deep down, he wondered if the house was simply waiting, biding its time until the real night's encounters began. That night, the house remained quiet for a while. Joseph lay awake, eyes half closed, listening to the faint rustling of the wind outside. Sleep was slow to come, and he kept catching himself glancing at the clock. 11:58 p.m. Then 11:59 p.m. The house seemed eerily still, as if holding its breath. Finally, the clock struck midnight. For a moment, everything was silent. Then a gentle creak echoed softly from the wall behind his headboard. It was a small, almost innocent sound, like a tiny, deliberate shift of the house settling into the cold night. But Joseph's senses prickled. He sat up slightly, alert. He listened carefully. At first, the house was silent, but then he noticed a faint, irregular scratching sound, like nails lightly dragging against the inside of the wall, or perhaps the floorboards beneath him. It was so soft he wasn't sure if he was imagining it, but it persisted, slow and uneven, as if something or someone was cautiously exploring the space just beyond his reach. Joseph's breath caught as he strained to hear the scratching again. It was faint, almost like a whisper of sound, but unmistakably there. He sat up straighter, eyes darting around the dark room, trying to pinpoint the source. The house was silent again, save for the soft, irregular scratching that seemed to come from the wall near the window. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the bedside lamp. The small light flickered to life, casting long shadows across the room. The scratching paused at once, as if whatever was making it had stopped upon sensing him. A cold sweat broke out on Joseph's forehead. Slowly, he swung his legs over the side of the bed, trying to steady his nerves. Every instinct told him to stay calm, but a growing sense of unease pushed him toward action. Carefully, he crept toward the door, listening intently for any new sounds. As he approached the window, he saw the curtains flutter again, this time more deliberately, as if someone or something was pressing against them from outside. He peered out through the glass, but the night was dark and empty. Still, the faint outline of the trees against the moonlight seemed to tremble slightly, causing shadows to dance along the wall. Then he noticed something else, an almost imperceptible smudge on the outside of the windowpane, similar to the faint fingerprint from earlier. His heart quickened. Was someone or something trying to communicate? Or was this just another trick of the wind and shadows? He stepped back, his mind racing. The scratching resumed, this time just a little louder, more insistent. It was as if whatever was outside was testing, probing, whether he was awake or asleep. The house felt suddenly colder, and the air grew thick with unspoken tension. Joseph hesitated, listening intently. Perhaps it was just a bird pecking at the window, leaving a bit of dirt or a small twig behind. Or maybe a rodent outside, scurrying along the roof or the gutter. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing mind. The house was quiet again, and the strange scratching seemed to have ceased. Shaking his head, he told himself it was nothing more than the house settling, or some harmless animal passing by. He flicked off the lamp and lay back down, telling himself to ignore the fleeting shadows and odd sounds. With a soft sigh, Joseph closed his eyes, determined to dismiss the night's disturbances as figments of his imagination. But as sleep finally claimed him, a faint, rhythmic tapping echoed once more, this time from the outside, just beyond his window. The familiar, gentle drumming persisted, slow and steady, reminding him that perhaps this night was not yet over. Yet as dawn approached, the sounds gradually faded, and Joseph drifted into a restless sleep. When morning came, he convinced himself it was just a passing anomaly, the house settling, a bird or a rodent. He pushed the night's disturbances to the back of his mind, determined to dismiss them as nothing more than his imagination. As the clock struck midnight again, the atmosphere outside grew eerily still. The faint tapping resumed, a little louder, more deliberate. Joseph sat up in bed, gripping his blanket tightly. The sound was rhythmic now, almost like a slow, unnatural heartbeat. He strained to listen, his eyes darting toward the window. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind pushed the curtains aside, revealing a faint silhouette just beyond the glass. It was too dark to make out clearly, but he could see a movement, something small but deliberate. The tapping persisted, now accompanied by a low, almost inaudible whispering, as if voices were trying to pierce through the night. The whispers curled around his mind, stirring a mixture of fear and curiosity. He blinked, convinced he was imagining it. The house creaked, the trees outside swayed, and the wind howled, anything to explain away the strange sounds. He reached for his phone to check the time. 12:07 a.m. The minutes felt like hours. Suddenly, the window shuttered slightly, and a faint, shadowy figure seemed to flicker at the edge of his vision. His heart pounded. Was this real? Or was his mind playing tricks on him? As the tapping slowed and the whispers faded into the night, Joseph knew one thing. whatever was outside was no longer just a simple disturbance. It was something far more unsettling, and it was just the beginning. By morning, Joseph lay in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. The events of the night replayed obsessively in his mind. Had he really seen that figure, heard those whispers, or was it all just a nightmare, his imagination running wild in the dark? He felt a gnawing sense of doubt creeping in. He got up slowly, trying to shake the feeling. The house looked normal, nothing out of place. He checked the windows and the garden outside, but everything seemed untouched, peaceful. For a moment, he wondered if he'd simply been overwhelmed by exhaustion or stress, causing his mind to conjure the strange sights and sounds. Yet deep down, a part of him knew the truth was far more complicated. The sensations had been too vivid, too real. The whispering, the shadow, those had been tangible. Could he really be losing his mind? Or was something unseen and sinister lurking just beyond his perception? He sat down with a cup of coffee, staring into the distance, torn between disbelief and dread. The night's events had shaken him to his core, and now he wasn't sure if he was still in control of his own mind, or if the nightmare was only just beginning. As the clock struck 12 once again, Joseph felt a strange heaviness settle over him. The house seemed to hold its breath, the silence pressing down like a thick fog. He sat upright in bed, eyes wide and alert, clutching the blankets as if they could shield him from whatever was to come. Suddenly, a faint but distinct tapping echoed through the darkness, not just outside his window, but now from within the room itself. It was slow, deliberate, and rhythmic, like a heartbeat echoing in the silence. The sound seemed to come from behind the walls, from the very fabric of his home. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead as the tapping grew louder, more insistent. He looked around, heart pounding, searching for the source. His eyes settled on the window, which now seemed to shimmer faintly, as if it were a mirror to something else, something dark and unseen. Then he saw it, a shadow slipping past the edge of the window, flickering like a dying flame. The whispering returned, more urgent, more insistent, voices overlapping in a cacophony that made his head spin. They spoke in distorted whispers, incomprehensible yet strangely familiar, as if echoing memories he couldn't quite grasp. The tapping suddenly stopped. Silence fell again, thick and oppressive. For a moment, Joseph thought it was over. But then, a slow, deliberate scrape began, like fingernails dragging across glass or wood, just beyond his sight. It was close, too close. His breath caught in his throat. He was paralyzed, caught between the urge to run and the need to understand. The shadows seemed to pulse, flickering in and out of view, teasing him with glimpses of something not quite human. And in that moment, Joseph realized whatever was outside, or perhaps inside, was no longer just toying with his senses. It was reaching out, trying to pull him into its darkness. He knew with a sinking certainty that this encounter was worse than the last, and that whatever awaited him at dawn might be more than just a nightmare. But even as the shadows danced and the whispers grew louder, a stubborn part of him refused to accept it as real. He clenched his fists, trembling, and whispered to himself, "This can't be happening. It's all in my head. It's just a bad dream. It has to be." Despite the mounting evidence, the flickering shadows, the scraping sounds, the whispering voices, he clung to that hope, desperately convincing himself that this was an illusion, a trick of his mind. He looked around the room, searching for anything that could prove him right. The clock glowed faintly in the dark, 12:15 a.m. The house was silent now, eerily so, save for the distant echoes of the night's disturbances. He told himself that the shadows were just shadows, that the whispers were nothing but his own imagination, that if he stayed still enough, it would all fade away. But deep down, he knew better. The cold sweat on his brow, the pounding of his heart, these sensations told a different story. Still, hope flickered within him like a fragile candle. Maybe, just maybe, this would be the last night he'd have to face whatever this was. Maybe dawn would bring clarity, or perhaps it would bring an end to the torment. He closed his eyes for a moment, battling the rising panic. "It's all in my head," he whispered again, more to convince himself than anyone else. "Tomorrow I'll wake up, and this will be gone." But as the darkness pressed in, and the nights, horrors lurked just beyond his sight, a tiny voice inside him whispered, "What if it's not?" As the clock struck 12 once more, the air in Joseph's room grew icy, and a heavy, oppressive silence settled over everything. This time, the darkness seemed thicker, pressing against his skin like a tangible force. Suddenly, the whispers returned, louder, more frantic, as if 1,000 voices had been unleashed all at once. They spoke in a chorus of despair, rage, and madness, echoing from every direction and seeming to seep from the very walls. The shadows coalesced into twisted, shifting forms, distorted figures with hollow eyes and jagged features, writhing like living smoke. They moved with a ghastly grace, circling around his bed, closing in. Their presence was suffocating, their whispers a cacophony that clawed at his mind. Then a scream split the night, a piercing, blood-curdling cry that seemed to come from within himself, and yet from somewhere else entirely. His heart pounded so violently, he thought it might burst. In that instant, the darkness exploded into a flash of black, blinding and swift. His eyes were drawn to a single silhouette, an impossibly dark figure that appeared before him. So sudden it seemed to materialize out of the void. Its form was shadowy, swirling and shifting, but most disturbing of all were its glowing red eyes, fiery, malevolent orbs that pierced through the darkness and into his soul. The creature's eyes burned with wrath that chilled him to the bone. It opened a maw of shadow, a gaping abyss of emptiness, as if to swallow him whole. The room seemed to ripple and distort around it, the air thick with malevolence. In that moment, Joseph's disbelief shattered. Reality buckled, and he was faced with something far beyond his understanding, something malevolent and ancient, feeding on his fear. The room seemed to warp and twist, the walls melting away into darkness, and his own voice caught in his throat as terror overwhelmed him. He knew with a dread certainty that this was no mere nightmare. Whatever lurked in the shadows was real, and it wanted him. Joseph awoke the next morning feeling drained, as if a heavy fog had settled deep inside his mind. His body was tense, and a lingering sense of dread clung to him like a second skin. Every time he closed his eyes, the nightmare from the previous night replayed in vivid detail. Those glowing red eyes, the shadowy figure flashing before him, the scream that still echoed faintly in his ears. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The world seemed altered, colors appeared dull, and even the simplest tasks felt heavy and exhausting. His thoughts were plagued with paranoia. Was he losing his grip on reality? Was he going crazy? Throughout the day, his peers noticed his pale face and haunted eyes. They exchanged worried glances, but no one dared ask directly. Instead, they subtly hinted, dropping comments like, "You look tired. Are you feeling all right?" Joseph appreciated their concern, but it only heightened his unease. He felt more isolated than ever, caught between the waking world and the nightmare that refused to leave his mind. As evening fell, a flicker of dread returned. He knew intuitively that tonight would be worse. The darkness was waiting. The clock struck midnight again, and the room grew colder, shadows stretching ominously across the walls. Joseph's heart hammered in his chest as an oppressive silence descended. This time the whispers returned, more frantic and urgent. The shadows writhed, coalescing into twisted forms, but something new lurked in the darkness. A faint, flickering glow emanated from the corner of his room. casting strange shadows that danced and whopped. Suddenly, from the corner, a figure emerged, more defined and terrifying than before. Its form was a swirling mass of darkness, with tendrils of shadow reaching out like claws. Its glowing red eyes pierced through the gloom, locking onto Joseph with a gaze that radiated pure malevolence. The creature's presence was overwhelming, filling the room with a suffocating sense of dread. Its eyes burned with hunger, and an unearthly growl rumbled from deep within its shadowy maw. Joseph froze, paralyzed by fear, as the creature advanced toward him. The room seemed to shake and distort around it, and for a moment he wondered if he would be consumed entirely by the darkness. In that instant, Joseph realized, whatever this entity was, it was far beyond anything he'd ever faced. The nightmare was far from over, and tonight he would have to confront the true depth of his terror. Frozen in place, Joseph's mind raced to find a way to escape or fight back, but his body refused to obey. The shadowy figure with glowing red eyes loomed closer, tendrils of darkness stretching out like grasping claws, threatening to envelop him entirely. Suddenly, a cold wind swept through the room, causing the shadows to ripple and flicker. The creature's eyes burned brighter, as if feeding on his fear. It let out a guttural, echoing growl that reverberated through his bones. As the shadowy figure advanced, Joseph's eyes widened with terror, but he found himself unable to speak or move. Instead, the creature's clawed appendage sliced through the air with brutal precision, raking across his chest. The sharp, cold pain tore into him as 3 deep scratches marred his skin, blood seeping slowly through the torn fabric of his shirt. The creature's claws left behind faint, glowing red scars, like fresh wounds carved into his flesh, before it let out a guttural snarl and dissolved back into the darkness. The room fell silent once more, the shadows retreating into the corners, leaving Joseph trembling and clutching his chest in shock. Blood trickled down his skin, staining his shirt, but it was the horror in his eyes that was the most terrifying. The entity had struck him, physically and psychologically, pushing him to the brink. He collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath, feeling a mix of pain and terror that refused to fade. His mind spiraled into paranoia. Every creak of the house, every shadow flickering in the corner, now seemed alive with threat. Sleep was impossible. The image of those claws and glowing eyes haunted him relentlessly. Fortunately, it was the weekend, so Joseph didn't have to face the outside world. He stayed indoors, barricading himself in his room, desperately trying to keep the terrifying memories at bay, even as a gnawing sense of dread persisted. As the clock struck midnight, a heavy, oppressive silence settled over the house. Joseph lay wide awake, clutching his chest where the scratches still throbbed, his mind racing with fear and paranoia. Every creak, every shadow seemed alive, each noise amplifying his dread. Suddenly, the darkness in the room seemed to ripple violently, as if a storm was brewing within it. Without warning, the shadows exploded outward, and the entity reappeared, not with its usual glowing eyes or claws, but as a force of destruction. It tore through his room with feral fury. Furniture splintered and shattered, drawers ripped from hinges, objects hurled across the space, crashing to the floor. The bed was overturned, walls scarred with scratch marks, and the window shattered into jagged shards. The air was thick with dust and the smell of broken wood. Throughout the chaos, the creature did not attack Joseph directly. Instead, it seemed to revel in destruction, expressing its rage or asserting dominance through chaos. Its form flickered in and out of the darkness, a looming, shadowy presence that left no corner untouched. When the storm of destruction finally subsided, the room was utterly wrecked. The creature vanished into the darkness as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving Joseph trembling amidst the wreckage. He lay there, stunned and overwhelmed, a cold sweat covering his body. His mind spiraled into paranoia. What was this creature? Why did it target his space, but not him? The unanswered questions gnawed at him, fueling his dread. He stayed motionless, afraid to move or make a sound, knowing this nightmare was far from over. The room, his sanctuary, was now a battleground, and he was left to face the terrifying aftermath alone, caught in a cycle of fear and uncertainty. As the final day of the weekend dawned, Joseph's mind spiraled further into chaos. The relentless fear and paranoia had taken over completely. Every shadow lurked with malicious intent. Every creak in the house sounded like a warning. His thoughts tangled in suspicion and dread, blurring the line between reality and hallucination. Unable to bear the mounting anxiety, and convinced that the entity was stalking him, Joseph made a frantic decision. He packed a small bag and fled from his house, heading straight to his parents' home, desperate for safety and reassurance. But as he arrived, a disturbing realization settled over him, the feeling that the entity had followed him. His paranoia deepened, twisting his perception of reality. He was certain he could feel unseen eyes watching him, lurking just beyond the edge of his vision. That night inside his parents' house, the torment did not stop. Without warning, Joseph felt an inexplicable, sinister presence. Shadows seemed to shift and stretch unnaturally, and an icy coldness seeped into the air. Suddenly, he started to feel a strange, almost compulsive sensation, like someone was tugging at his legs, pulling him, trying to destabilize him. He looked down, trembling, but found no marks, no bruises, no evidence of any physical assault. It was as if the entity was pulling at his mind, playing with his perception, making him doubt his own senses. His family noticed him pacing anxiously, talking to himself, eyes darting around the room, as if he expected something to leap out at any moment. They couldn't see what he saw, nor feel what he felt, but the growing panic in his voice was unmistakable. Throughout the night, Joseph's grip on reality continued to unravel. The entity's invisible manipulations intensified, pulling his legs, whispering cruelly in his mind, feeding his paranoia. No one else could see or hear these things, but Joseph was convinced that the darkness was alive, and that it was relentlessly tormenting him. By morning, exhausted and broken, Joseph was lost in a haze of madness, his mind teetering on the brink. The entity had succeeded in shattering his sense of reality, leaving him isolated, paranoid, and utterly consumed by terror. Joseph arrived at work that morning disheveled and distracted. His eyes darted nervously, and his speech was frantic. His boss, noticing his unusual behavior, confronted him sharply. "Joseph, are you all right? You haven't been yourself lately. What's going on?" Unable to focus or give a coherent answer, Joseph's anxiety skyrocketed. His paranoia flared anew, and he suddenly burst into tears, trembling as he clutched his head. Realizing he was spiraling further, his boss made a quick decision. She called Joseph's parents, explaining the situation. Within minutes, they arrived at the office, worry etched into their faces. After a tense discussion, it was clear Joseph needed professional help. They decided to escort him back to his house, accompanied by the police for safety. Joseph, in a state of panic, was visibly distressed, convinced that the entity was waiting for him there. When they arrived at Joseph's house, the scene was horrific. His room was a chaotic mess, furniture overturned, walls scratched and stained with dirt, belongings scattered and broken. It looked as if a tempest had torn through the space. Joseph's parents looked on in horror as the police began to secure the area. Joseph, overwhelmed and distraught, was led inside. His mind was unraveling, fear gripping every fiber of his being. He was quickly taken to a mental health facility. The staff, recognizing his distress, placed him in a secured ward. Despite their efforts, Joseph's paranoia and agitation intensified. He kept trying to escape, desperate to flee the unseen horrors tormenting him. As midnight approached, Joseph's anxiety reached a breaking point. Convinced that the worst was imminent, he spiraled into full-blown panic. His screams echoed through the ward as staff, fearing for his safety, strapped him to the bed to prevent him from hurting himself or others. Despite their efforts, the staff did not monitor Joseph as closely as they perhaps should have. They strapped him to the bed, a standard precaution for severely agitated patients, then left him alone in the dimly lit room. Their minds were occupied with other urgent cases, and they believed that securing him was enough to prevent harm. As the clock neared midnight, a sinister stillness filled the room. Joseph, strapped to the bed, trembled violently, eyes wide with terror. Suddenly, shadows rippled and swelled around him, coalescing into a writhing swarm of dark, whispering figures. They slithered up from the corners, the edges of the room, closing in with malevolent intent. Without warning, the entities surged forward, wrapping around Joseph's neck and chest, their cold, shadowy forms tightening like a noose. A cacophony of screams erupted, distorted, ghostly voices echoing through the ward as they shouted in unison, "Your soul is mine." Joseph's face turned red and then pale as he struggled desperately, but the entity's grip was unyielding. His body convulsed as he was choked, the last of his screams fading into silence. His eyes flickered with the faintest glimmer of life before they dulled completely. When the staff arrived, they found the room eerily quiet. Joseph was limp, unresponsive, his face frozen in a grimace. They quickly checked for vital signs. No pulse, no breathing. One staff member, trying to rationalize what they saw, muttered, "Maybe he just stopped breathing. Maybe the stress got to him. It's probably a natural cause." They performed CPR, but despite their efforts, there was no response. The monitors remained silent, confirming Joseph had died. The staff exchanged uncertain glances, unable to explain the inexplicable. The dark shadows lingering just beyond the faint glow of the moonlight filtering into the room. In the cold silence that followed, it was clear that whatever malevolent force had haunted Joseph had finally claimed him, silencing his suffering forever, leaving behind only whispers of screams and the chilling memory of the night he was consumed by darkness. As the shadows receded, Joseph's spirit was dragged into the darkness, entwined forever with the malevolent entity that had claimed him. Like many before him, his soul was now a prisoner, a haunting echo trapped within the abyss of shadow and despair. The entity, a primordial force born from chaos and torment, feeds on fear and suffering, an ancient darkness that preys on the vulnerable, luring them into its endless nightmare.